For the last 3 decades, the world lived under the comforting illusion that borders no longer mattered. Goods could move freely across oceans, money flowed across continents in milliseconds, and multinational corporations operated as if the entire planet were one single marketplace. This idea, known as globalization, was sold as the ultimate solution for prosperity. Cheap labor abroad meant cheaper products at home. Outsourced manufacturing meant higher profits. Open trade meant rapid economic growth. And for a while, it truly looked like the world was becoming one interconnected economic engine. But beneath this smooth narrative, powerful cracks were forming. Globalization created winners and losers, and the losers were not silent forever. As Western factories shut down and jobs moved overseas, communities were hollowed out. Political anger grew. Countries that had once been quiet players suddenly became central manufacturing giants. Supply chains became longer, more complex, and more fragile. And then the world got its first real shock. A global pandemic that froze trade, shut down ports, halted travel, and exposed how vulnerable the system really was. Suddenly, everything depended on countries thousands of miles away. Medicine, chips, food, fuel, nothing was local anymore. When one factory in Asia shut down, assembly lines in Europe and America stopped within weeks. When shipping containers piled up at ports, shelves went empty. Globalization was not a strength, it was a dependency, a dangerous one. And now the world is waking up to a new reality. Openness creates efficiency, but independence creates survival. Nations are no longer asking, how do we trade more? Instead, they are asking, how do we protect ourselves? The age of a borderless world is ending. Not with a crash, but with a slow, deliberate rebuilding of walls, each one designed to shield nations from the vulnerabilities they ignored for far too long. For decades, globalization thrived on one silent assumption: energy would always be cheap, reliable, and available to everyone. But the moment that assumption fractured, the world began drifting back into the old pattern of borders, rivalry, and self-protection. The modern world runs on invisible arteries: oil pipelines, LNG terminals, rare earth supply chains, and electricity grids that cross continents. When these arteries weaken, nations panic. And in panic, borders rise. The first major shock came when global oil supplies fluctuated, not because of scarcity, but because of geopolitics. A single conflict, sanction, or shipping blockade could suddenly raise prices globally, pushing countries to think, why are we so dependent on others for something we literally cannot survive without? From there, the strategy shifted. Energy security became national security. Europe, once deeply interconnected, saw how dangerous overdependence on a single exporter could be. Parts of Asia learned the same lesson when coal and gas shortages shut down factories overnight. Even the United States, one of the world's largest producers, realized that energy independence didn't guarantee stability if supply chains for rare earth minerals and solar components were dominated by countries with competing interests. This triggered a global scramble. Governments rushed to lock in exclusive energy partnerships. Countries stopped exporting critical materials. Others diverted ships mid-route. And suddenly, the idea of a borderless world felt childish. The geopolitical map started to reshape itself around who controls energy, who produces it, who processes it, and who gets left out. Energy scarcity didn't just raise prices, it raised walls. It reminded nations that cooperation works only when resources flow freely. But the moment they don't, alliances bend, neighbors turn cautious, and globalization begins to reverse. This was the beginning of the world dividing into energy-secure and energy-insecure blocks, each building its own walls. For decades, globalization was treated like an unstoppable force, a natural evolution of human progress. Borders were opening, trade was expanding, and nations were becoming increasingly interconnected. But today, that direction has quietly reversed. Instead of moving toward one unified global system, the world is fragmenting into regional blocks, each building its own supply chains, security alliances, and economic walls. This shift didn't happen overnight. It began when countries realized that relying too heavily on distant nations for essentials, energy, food, technology, or manufacturing, was a strategic weakness. The pandemic exposed just how fragile global supply chains were. A single shutdown in China could halt factories in Europe, and a crisis in one region could trigger shortages everywhere else. Suddenly, leaders across the world were confronted with a harsh truth. Globalization made economies efficient, but it also made them vulnerable. In response, powerful nations started reshoring industries, securing local supply chains, and forming exclusive trade groups. The US focused on the Americas, Europe strengthened its internal alliances, China expanded its influence in Asia through Belt and Road, and the Middle East began consolidating power around energy and logistics. These blocs are no longer cooperating globally. They are competing for control, resources, and influence. The consequences are massive. Prices rise as production becomes more regional. Smaller countries are forced to choose sides. Multinational corporations restructure their entire strategies. And the dream of a single interconnected world is replaced by a future where 4 or 5 competing zones dominate politics and economics. Globalization didn't die loudly. It faded softly, replaced by a world where every nation is building walls, fortifying borders, and preparing for a future defined not by unity, but by division. As globalization weakens, the world is quietly reorganizing itself into smaller, more defensive economic groups, often called regional blocs. These blocs are not new, but their purpose has changed. Earlier, they existed to boost trade and cooperation. Now, they are becoming the world's primary tool for economic survival, strategic control, and protection from global chaos. The European Union, for instance, was once a symbol of open borders and shared prosperity. Today, it is rapidly transforming into a fortress-like economic shield, tightening rules on migration, securing energy supply chains within the bloc, and creating strict technology and data regulations. The EU's priority is no longer global leadership, it is self-preservation. Similarly, Asia is moving toward its own economic clustering. China, Russia, Iran, and parts of Central Asia are integrating into a parallel system of banking, trade routes, and digital infrastructure designed specifically to bypass Western influence. This is not cooperation, it is alignment against dependency. The message is clear: rely on your own group, not the world. North America is shifting too. The US, Canada, and Mexico are increasingly interconnected through nearshoring, energy deals, and manufacturing alliances. Instead of depending on Asia for production, the US is trying to create a continental supply chain, forming what analysts call Fortress America. Africa and South America are following the same pattern, building regional financial networks, food supply chains, and energy partnerships to avoid being vulnerable to global shocks. What's emerging is not a united planet, but a fragmented world of 4 to 6 economic islands, each with its own currencies, rules, and digital ecosystems. Globalization promised one interconnected world, but the future looks more like a map of isolated fortresses, each protecting itself from the instability outside. When nations turn inward, the human consequences don't appear immediately on news headlines. They unfold slowly, quietly, and painfully. The first group affected is workers whose livelihoods depend on global supply chains. Millions of factory employees, shipping workers, tech developers, and export-dependent farmers face shrinking opportunities as trade routes tighten and cross-border business becomes unpredictable. Entire regions built on manufacturing for the world suddenly find their economic engine stalling. Next comes the consumer. For decades, globalization kept prices low because countries specialized in what they produced best. But as walls rise again, goods become more expensive to make, transport, and store. The cost of everything, food, electronics, medicine, clothing, begins to climb. Inflation doesn't just appear because money supply increases. It appears because the world stops cooperating. And ordinary families feel this long before economists announce it. Small nations are hit the hardest. Countries that relied on imports for energy, food, or technology now face scarcity. Those that depended on exports find themselves cut out of markets that once kept them alive. Without the protection of strong alliances, their bargaining power disappears. But the deepest impact is psychological. People grow suspicious of foreigners. Governments push nationalistic narratives. Social trust declines as citizens fear losing what little remains. Deglobalization is not just an economic shift, it is a social fracture. In the end, the rich adapt, Corporations relocate, and global elites continue their operations. But the middle and working classes bear the full weight of a world breaking into isolated, competing blocks, with fewer opportunities, fewer choices, and a far harsher future.